Jesus and Jairus' daughter. Now the story starts in verse 41, and Jairus, a concerned father, is begging Jesus to come and save his 12-year-old daughter who is at the point of death in his home. And so Jesus goes along with Jairus to his home. Now the text specifically tells us that Jesus was being jostled by the crowd. There were a lot of people all around Jesus. They were following Jesus, they were walking to the side of Jesus, and some were going ahead of him because they knew where he was going. So Jesus was being pressed in on all sides by a crowd of people. When he gets to the house, one of the first things he says to the parents is, "Do not fear, only believe, and she will be saved." The people laugh at him because they know that the girl is already dead. In fact, the mourners, the professional mourners, those who were paid to weep, were already weeping outside the house. This was, you might say, an early version of Facebook, letting the community know that there was a death in the family. And when Jesus goes into the house, he touches that little girl and he raises her by the hand and he says, "Talitha cum," which is a way of saying, "Little girl," or my little lamb, it's time to get up." And Jesus raises this 12-year-old girl from the dead. Now, this story is an example of a sandwich in the Gospels. In the Gospels, you sometimes have a story that starts here, and then it ends over here, but in the middle, you have a second story. And that second story adds the meaning to the wider story. It's a bit like a sandwich. If I were to say to you, "Would you like a sandwich?" your first question is, well, what's in the sandwich? So what matters is not the bread on the outside, but what the filling of the sandwich is on the inside. Would you rather have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? Would you rather have a cheese and tomato sandwich? Or would you like some other version? And so spliced in the middle of this story of Jairus and his daughter is a story of a woman with an issue of blood for 12 years. And as Jesus is walking to Jairus' house, this woman creeps up behind Jesus in the crowd. She is ceremonially unclean because she has an issue of blood. So theoretically, everybody she touches is now ceremonially unclean. So she comes to Jesus with fear and trembling, worried about what the social response will be if all these men around Jesus discover they've been touched by a ritually unclean woman. She has spent all that she has on doctors. She is still suffering. There is no earthly hope for this woman, so she comes close to Jesus. The story tells us in Luke chapter 8 that she touched the hem of his robe. She didn't necessarily touch his body, she touched the hem of his robe. In those days, your robe might drag along the ground. Together with the soles of your shoes, this was the dirtiest part about you. And so, in faith, she reaches out through the crowd and she touches the dirtiest parts of Jesus that she can, which is the hem of his robe. And Jesus immediately stopped, and he looked around, and he said, "Who touched me?" The disciples are saying, "Master, you're surrounded by a crowd of people. They're all jostling and pressing in on you, and people are poking you, and they're rubbing you shoulder to shoulder. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus knew that power had gone out of him, and he looked around, and he saw this woman cowering, and he refers to her first as daughter. Just as Jairus was concerned about his 12-year-old girl, so Jesus was concerned about this woman of faith, whom he referred to as his daughter. And the woman comes forward trembling, and Jesus he asks her, "Please tell me your story." And so she tells her story. The pain, the shame, the doctors, the financial expense, maybe the bankruptcy, the social uncleanliness, the fact that with an issue of blood, she wouldn't have been allowed into the temple or the synagogue for 12 years because she was unclean. She was a social and a religious outcast. And she tells her whole story, not just to Jesus, but in the hearing of all those men who were standing around Jesus. Jesus affirms to her that it is her faith has saved her, not the touch. And Jesus turns to Jairus and he says, "Only believe and your daughter will be saved." In this passage here, we see that it is not so much the touch of Jesus physically that saves, but it is faith in Jesus that heals and saves. The Greek word for healing, sozo, is the same word for salvation, to be saved. So when it said, when Jesus says to blind Bartimaeus at the end of Mark chapter 10, go in faith, go in peace, your faith has healed you. That word healed can also mean saved. So what 3 lessons do we learn from this story of this woman who came up behind Jesus? The first lesson is this: many people will press in around Jesus, but few people will be touched by Jesus. The crowd was jostling Jesus from all sides. They were rubbing shoulder to shoulder. There were people in front, there were people behind. But Jesus' healing power only flowed to one individual in that crowd, and it was the woman. We may think we're following Jesus. We may walk in the same direction Jesus. We may be wanting to meet Jesus in the New Jerusalem. We may be trying to follow the teachings of Jesus. But despite all of this, like that crowd, we may never have experienced the touch of Jesus. Second thing we learn from this story is that when Jesus does touch us, when Jesus does transform a part of our lives, we are called to testify to his goodness and his mercy in our lives. That woman spoke up. She told her whole story, warts and all, as we say in England. She related the highs and the lows, the pain, the shame, the suffering, and the uncleanliness. She told her whole story, not just to Jesus, but before the whole crowd. And we are likewise called to testify to God's goodness in our lives when Jesus does something special for us. And thirdly, this story reminds us that we don't have to live 2,100 years ago in Palestine in order to receive the healing touch of Jesus. Jesus says to Jairus, "Only believe, and your daughter will be saved." And so he says to the woman, "Your faith has saved you." He does not say to the woman, "Your touch has saved you," but it is your faith has saved you. And likewise, we may be touched by Jesus through the touch of faith today. And through that touch, we may also receive his healing and his saving power. So I want to encourage you today. This is a beautiful story of Jesus. It's given to encourage us. It's given to guide us. It reminds us that even if we think we're walking in the Christian way, we're invited to spend time with Jesus personally on a daily basis to hear him speaking to us through the Gospels that we might receive his touch. The story is a reminder to us that when Jesus touches us, God asks us to tell forth of his goodness in our lives. We are to enter his courts with thanksgiving and praise. Praise for who God is, and thanksgiving that is publicly testifying to God's goodness in our lives. And finally, we are healed not by physical touch, but through faith. May God grant each one of us the walk with Jesus, where we experience his touch, where we testify to his goodness in our lives, and where day by day we receive the touch of faith and our lives are healed until one day all things will be made new again. May God walk with us, and may we walk with him, as did that woman behind Jesus, as did Jairus and his wife, and ultimately as did his daughter. May we walk with Jesus